Introduce Angela, who's been attending a lot of our sessions. Angela, do you want to come up here? She's an amazing resource that's part of the Fung Institute. Okay, phones away, please. Computers away. Turn off the phone. Okay, thank you. Angela, do you want to briefly introduce yourself and talk about what you do here?
Yeah. So I just started working at the Fung on contract as a career coach mid-August. And so my background is, for the last 10 years, I was a recruiter and a coach for teams in startups across the Bay Area in a lot of different industries, e-commerce, SaaS, location-based mobile marketing, etc. So I have an insider view of how resumes are read. I've read thousands of resumes, and yes, we do read them in seconds, and how you should position yourself. I've read tons of cover letters. I've created interview structures. I've been in interviews.
Very good resource that is in-house. I would really strongly suggest you make use of her, set up a time. Can they meet with you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah?
I
Okay.
have a calendar, and if you don't find a spot, you can always email me. Sometimes I do remote appointments. I'm here 3 days a week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Okay, do you all know how to get a hold of her? Raise your hand if you do not. Okay, how should they get a hold of you? Where can they find your calendar and email?
Yeah, I think it's in the Fun Connect. If they go in there in the careers resources, we have a calendar that you can get into from there.
Okay. All right. Very good. Awesome. Thank you, Angela. Great.
And I've just finished my own master's, so I'm well aware of what you're going through. Also a one-year program, and I did my research project on salary negotiation after training. So
wow.
Oh, that's cool.
Information on.
Which a bunch of you asked questions about.
I want an appointment.
She is our expert. Please contact her. We're very lucky to have her here at Berkeley. Okay, we're going to take a seat.
Does sound good.
Okay, so thank you,
Do you have to be a
Angela.
student to sign up with you?
I know,
Can I swing
right?
by? Sounds good.
Okay, everybody. It's good to be back. Can somebody close the door, please? We should shame the people that walk in late. Everybody stare at them. Okay, it's good to have you guys back. I missed you. We were out last week. Happy to be back. We have an excellent speaker this week. My friend Roy is here. So Roy is actually different than a lot of our other speakers that we've had. So Fung Institute is engineering leadership. Roy is so far our first engineering leader in a big company, right? We've had a lot of founders. We've had a lot of product heads. We've had go-to-market heads. We've had sales operations. We've had marketing. Roy is an engineer. Okay, he's an engineer and he's an engineering leader. Okay, VP of Engineering at NextGen. We're extraordinarily lucky to have him here today. So let's give him a hand and say thank you, Roy.
My pleasure. It's a real pleasure to come out and talk with you guys. And I'm sure you'll probably say this or already have, but I absolutely welcome questions and making this interactive as we go. It doesn't have to be just, us holding court.
Yeah. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear Roy?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect.
All right.
Okay, Roy, welcome.
Thank you.
So I have a lot of things to ask you about engineering, about identifying leaders, about being a leader, but I like to always start off to first kind of hear about your background. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Michigan, north of Flint. If anybody from Michigan, you know that we always have to go like this. I was right about there on the map of Michigan. That's a standard thing. Near Flint, famous for Roger and me, kind of a rural area. And went to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor for my undergraduate.
Okay.
And then ended up coming to California in '96 for permanently. Yeah.
Okay, what was your major in undergraduate?
I started off with electrical engineering because I wanted to build R2-D2. One of those things when I was 7, that was when I fell in love, and somebody said, oh, you want to be an electrical engineer? Got about 3/4 of the way through my degree before I figured out that all the things that were electrical engineering, like the analog electronics, the electromagnetic field theory, I sucked at. And everything that was discrete and computer-based and logic, like that stuff I excelled at. So at the last minute, it became computer engineering, as I kind of realized where my strengths were not.
Okay, so computer engineering. And so when you were leaving Michigan, did you have a sense of what you wanted to do?
So I had the good fortune that when I started my undergraduate, I had applied at a school that's now called Kettering Institute. At the time it was General Motors Institute. And they had a thing where you had to get a job in industry, and you would alternate between semesters of work and school, and you had to do this. So I had gotten hooked up with this little startup company doing automotive industry testing, which was really fun because I had to smash bumpers and smash tires and smash lots of things. And so I got dumped right into an software engineering job, kind of on day one of my undergraduate, which was fabulous. And if any of you have worked for really small companies, large companies give you lots of resources, you have resources available, that's nice. But small companies give you unreasonable amounts of responsibility because they just, they have no choice, right? Well, we need somebody to go do a presentation to the board, how about you? But you're nearby. So by the time I graduated, I had been in software engineering roles for 4 or 5 years, and was pretty happy with it. So I had a pretty good idea that I liked software.
Yeah, it's like Berkeley used to have as an undergraduate program an externship program that was really, really strong when I was an undergrad here. And so that's why I'm really happy about the Fung Institute. They have these capstone projects which are integrated.
That is cool. We've been talking a lot about this.
Yeah. Roy's hopefully going to be one of our industry people coming up. So that gave you a sense of computer engineering. So what was your first job then that you had?
So coming out of my undergraduate, I was working in that same industry. If you work in Michigan in technology, there's a really good chance you work with cars in some way, which really was not my thing, actually. And I will make a plug for whoever your early mentors are, treat them really well and be nice to them because one of my closest friends today, a guy named Ken Legault, who was my first boss, he ended up leaving Michigan, coming to California, and we had stayed in touch, and he said, Roy, you really ought to come out to California. This is really Mecca. This is the promised land. So I went, I don't know. I'm just kind of nice in Michigan. I came out to California, slept on Ken's couch for a week, and by the end of the week, had 3 job offers for double my salary in Michigan. I went, oh, yeah, California is cool. So
there seems to be a pattern with all of our speakers that they just came out here and got a bunch of offers.
Well, it might depend on the time. This
I don't
was
hear that from anybody else.
1990s, was a ways back.
Okay.
So there's these cycles for sure. And of course, it depends on meeting some of the right people to help make some connections for sure. But that was tremendously valuable to me. So then I came out moved out for good in '96. And that was a real turning point because I had decided I'm interested in sound. So at the time, DigiDesign, Sonic Solutions, some of the companies that were a big deal in sound and recording studio equipment, things like this, right? But I got an introduction to a company called Starfish down in Scotts Valley. I didn't know anything about Santa Cruz, I didn't know anything about Scotts Valley. But Starfish was founded by a guy named Philippe Kahn, who was founder of Borland, went on to have a bunch of other companies, were very successful, and he was an absolute industry luminary. And I just fell in love with the excitement of this startup. So I moved to Scotts Valley, sight unseen, had no idea what this was going to be like, just kind of packed a bag and headed on down there, and I still live there. So I've been there ever since.
What is Starfish, or what did they do? If there's
personal information management and then synchronization. At the time, if you had data on your phone didn't have internet, so it wasn't like the contacts on your phone would get on your computer, would get into the cloud. That didn't happen automatically. You had to plug things in, so it was all synchronization. And then we ended up moving into small devices. In fact, I brought some props. I think you guys might find this amusing. Starfish created a little PDA. It was anybody ever heard the term PCMCIA card or PC card? It was a little credit card size organizer. This will probably predate your smartphones by a bit. But this little guy we built, and it just slides right into the computer, and that's how it would synchronize all the data. So just take all your data with you. And then the most noteworthy thing that we did, and ended up being kind of the thing of the longest lasting impact, was we created what was really the world's first camera phone. Now today, this is a little bit comical, because this was the phone, and this was the camera. Camera phone is, little, but you just snap right on there. And the funny part is it actually has like a mechanical viewfinder, because it didn't have enough horsepower to let you see the picture in real time on this tiny little display. But it was actually the very first camera phone. And it was an absolute blast, working with a company that had the audacity to try and make things like that. Yeah, it made it super fun.
That's really interesting. So when you said you fell in love with sound, did they work in audio or sound?
No, that was just one of those splitting moments where you go, ooh, this is a thing I love, but this other company seems so exciting. So I ended up going with a company that was doing something completely different than kind of where my interests were, because I was just excited about the team and the company. And I think that ended up being a good thing. I learned so much and had so many more opportunities. It's obviously really beneficial if you can get attached to something that's growing. And the companies that were doing things that I was really personally interested in were not growing at nearly the rate as this little startup that was willing to twist and turn and try different things. We redefined our mission statement almost annually. And it was constantly, oh yeah, well the company was founded in order to blah, 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 and whatever blah, blah, blah was changed every year, just to figure out where the product market fit was. And that growth meant we had incredible opportunities to learn and get more responsibility.
Guys, I have about 10,000 questions, so if you have any, raise your hand, interrupt, because I'm going to just keep on firing away. Any questions?
So far, so good.
So far, so good? Oh, there we go. Very reliable. You always have a question. That's great. Okay.
Do I need the mic?
Ah,
Okay.
thank you. We need our mic to be passed over.
Or I can just repeat the question if you want.
Yeah, that could work too.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, you just said that the company was growing far more than these other sound companies.
Right.
Do you know that from hindsight, or when you were coming into the space, were you able to tell that it was a growing company, and if so, how?
So when I interviewed, I mentioned I was literally in town for a week, and I just found the companies that looked interesting, and I had sent out a few resumes ahead of time, and then I was going to fly out on Saturday morning back to Michigan. I got a call on Friday morning that said, hey, such and such gave your resume to so-and-so, and we want you to come down to Scotts Valley and interview. I said, well, flying out tomorrow, so I don't know if we're going to be able to hook that up. And they said, come down tonight. So, tonight, okay, what time? How's like 7:30? It's Friday night, 7:30. Right on. These guys are serious. So I get in the car, I go down there, I'm thinking somebody, some poor schmuck, has got to stay late and interview me. I kind of feel bad for him, but if you're willing to do it, I'll come down and interview with you. I get there, there's got to be 30 people still there. This is a small company. There were only 60 people at that time. And I'm like, you would never guess it was 7:30 on a Friday night. Now, a lot of you might very reasonably hear this story and be like, big red warning signs. Don't take this job. Whole work-life balance not happening in this place. But for where I was at, I wasn't looking for work-life balance. I was only bummed that they didn't have dormitories on the roof, so I didn't have to bother to rent an apartment I wasn't going to be in. Because I just wanted something to pour myself into. And it was that kind of place where that was that level of excitement and energy. So the energy was unmistakable. You felt it when you walked in the door. Yeah, it was cool.
That's a really good question. I was wondering the exact same thing. So if you had to look back on your own experience, maybe that was an indicator for you. Knowing what you know now, what other factors would you look at if you're going to walk into a startup besides the fact that they're there until 10 o'clock at night? What other things would be positive or negative indicators for you?
So much early on is about getting opportunities to do things. And I'm partial to smaller companies in many ways because it's just a lot easier to get visibility. Now, it's not that you can't do it in a larger company. You can. But it's easier to get lost. It's easier to be part of a group that you don't really understand how it fits into the larger scheme. And of course, if the company is doing well, doing the right things, you should know that. But it's just easy to get lost. So I feel like I benefited tremendously from starting off with smaller companies and then going through the cycle a few times of smaller company gets bought by a larger company. Well, now you get the opportunity to learn what is a larger company, how does that work? Because they're very different animals, of course, right? But it's that pathway from a smaller company through acquisition into a larger company gives you a breadth of perspective that I found to be very valuable.
So if you were working for Starfish and it's a company that does cameras, optics, maybe some audio, think about a small company versus a large company. If you're a software engineer, or an engineer in general, but you're not maybe super familiar with these different areas, optics or cameras, I guess now it's a little bit different, but how did you go about actually even learning like this content in these areas?
A lot of these things all you can do is be prepared as much as possible yourself for the thing that you want, but I find if you look at what actually ends up happening, a lot of times the connections are things you can't predict. So making sure that you're doing a good job, staying in touch with each other. You guys have an incredible resource here together as a cohort. It's not necessarily obvious how important that is now. But years and years and years from now, this will continue to be a source of opportunities to go, hey, Joe, I haven't talked to you in a while. What are you up to? And it's really valuable. So in my case, because I had started off in a job where we were doing testing systems and things I mentioned, smashing bumpers and blowing up tires and things like that, it was real-time data acquisition and control. So low-level programming to hey, program this, hydraulic ram to hit this thing and take this data from these accelerometers, and that was the space I was in. So it was low-level programming, not something I thought I particularly wanted to do, but it was what got me hired. Because Philippe Kahn, who wanted to build this little PDA, it's like, oh boy, we're going to have to write this literally on the metal. There's no operating system. We're going to have somebody who can write the code from the first boot instruction of the CPU when it powers up at that level. And so we need low-level guys, and he saw my resume and went, yeah, that looks like it'll work. I had no idea when I was hired that that's what we were going to end up doing, and we ended up doing lots of other things as well. But it's just, all I could really say is if you have an area direction you want to go, obviously if you can do projects on your own in that space, that's huge. Especially, and it's so much easier now. Do a project on your own, put it on LinkedIn, put it on Facebook, and there's a decent chance that once your name, you put your resume around, people will find that stuff and go, oh look, she built something that looks exactly like what we're doing. What a coincidence.
All right, questions?
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit earlier about how you liked the fact that the company you're at was constantly pivoting and redefining itself. But at what point, I guess, in your mind, why was that a good thing as opposed to a company that's that knows exactly what it wants to be and has a very clear vision?
I should actually clarify. If I said I liked that, I kind of chose the wrong word. I think in hindsight, the thing that was good about that was that the company and its leadership were willing to, they were very creative and they were willing to continue to twist and turn until they found that product market fit. And that's a term that we didn't have back then, but it's a really useful one. And it's a handy term to explain why that dynamic was necessary. You need some vision that you use to found your company, and whatever that vision is probably wrong. or it's at least significantly wrong. You know, we'll end up, I'm sure, talking about the fact that I then started a company on my own. Particular product vision was wrong and had to pivot entirely into a completely different industry in order to figure out how does, you know, where do you find the thing that really ultimately starts to take off. So it's not fun. It's a lot more fun if you just have the, you know, the Facebook idea or whatever, you know, take your pick, right out of the gate, and then you just ride the rocket ship. But mostly, I think startups are fundamentally about this experimentation until you find that traction. And it hurts, and it's no fun, the turning part, because then you throw code away, and that's no fun, but you have to learn to love that because less code is better. But it's painful. You know, you have to let some of your babies go. We built lots of stuff that, you know, I have little plaques on my shelf of like, oh, remember that product? I still have some of these little shrink wrap boxes that, you know, they sold at Fry's. I was very proud to see my package on the shelf at Fry's. Nobody knows those products anymore. You know? So, yeah.
Good question.
Yeah.
You mentioned about how you walked in and you saw 30 people at 7:30 on a Friday.
Yeah.
How do you differentiate between that being a sign of them bailing out the ship because it's sinking, or charging full speed ahead?
It's a good question.
Can you repeat his question?
Yeah, so thank you for reminding me. The question was, you see 7:30 at night, there's 30 people there. You know, how do you know if that's excitement because things are going up, or panic and bailing because things are going down? I'm trying to think if I could tell you with really great confidence that I would have been able to tell the difference at that time. I mean, I think so. It felt qualitatively like excitement. You know, you could just feel that. And I know that's a mushy answer, but it didn't feel like people were in a state of negative panic. It felt, in fact, this is a perfect tie into what we were talking to earlier. It felt like what now I call positive urgency. And there's probably a better term for this, and maybe somebody here can help me refine the term. But if you want urgency, of course, right? You want people to feel like, hey, we got to go fast, we got to bring energy. But a lot of times, the way people try to accomplish that urgency is urgency through fear. Here's what's going to happen if we don't. We're going to lose our funding. Somebody's going to come eat our lunch in the marketplace. It's going to be bad, you know. And that'll motivate, but it's not nearly as effective a motivator as something being drawn into an exciting vision. That kind of urgency is fundamentally different in terms of how people show up and in their work. And we were talking earlier about that one of the ways that I think it's really significant is in innovation. You know, if you look at, and there's lots of studies around this, but people will innovate a lot more if they feel safe, because in order to innovate, you have to be willing to look stupid, right? I got this crazy idea, nobody's done it before. Chances are it's going to fail. Okay, well, now I look stupid. But of course you have to go past that, right? And realize that that's where innovation happens, is trying the thing that like, it's going to sound like a bad idea. And probably it is, but one in whatever will be great. And if you have that positive urgency, then that's a space in which people will show up with those ideas, because there's a sense of possibility, like, oh, if we could do this, if we could do that. Then it draws people out. Whereas that negative dynamic of, you know, I'm driven out of fear because, you know, we're going to lose in the marketplace, I'm going to lose my job. That's not a place that inspires anybody to take risks. You know, quite the opposite. You guys have probably no doubt heard about Netflix has, you know, their famed culture deck, and, you know, they're going to be a sports team, right? And you know, if you show up at Netflix, is everybody familiar with kind of the story of Netflix culture and kind of how they've defined it at all? If you get a chance, check it out. The Netflix culture deck is a seminal document of Scotts Valley, according to, you know, Sheryl Sandberg, which I think is of Silicon Valley, I should say. I think that's accurate. But what they did is they defined a culture where instead of a bunch of the usual blah, 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 they really went out on a limb and they really put a stake in the ground and said, if you have average, normal performance at Netflix, that's going to earn you a respectful severance package. And if you're not crushing it, that's great. You know, we glad you were here. Thanks for your time. And I'm sure you'll do well someplace else, but they take it seriously. I mean, they will fire you for what would be very reasonable but non-exceptional performance in other companies. And that was a bold move for them to make, right? And it's really interesting to think about, well, what does that do for the culture? And what does that do to the culture? What it does for the culture is it makes it prestigious to work at Netflix, because everybody knows that. So, oh, you work at Netflix and you haven't been fired yet. That's amazing. You must be really hot. But do you show up feeling safe at Netflix? What risks are you willing to take? How far are you going to go out on a limb? Do you want to draw any attention to yourself in a potentially negative way? Netflix is doing really well, and I'm not here to say that they should or shouldn't do it that way, but I feel like in this particular way, that's a very risky culture play, because I think you need some safety in order to have innovation thrive. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a really good, I'll get to you in a second, there's a really good article that I can send to the class that describes what Roy is talking about. The concept is called psychological safety.
It's a good term.
Yeah, there's an article in the New York Times from maybe about 5 years ago called Google and its Quest for the Perfect Team. Google has done all this internal studies and analysis of kind of what teams were the most high performing. And it kind of describes actually a story about this one engineer who was very sick and, told his teammates that he was very ill, and, overall the team, maybe I'm recounting it a little off, but overall the team started doing better overall once they started kind of sharing their individual stories. And the concept is that, when you kind of like look at all variables in the long term, the teams that tend to be the most high performing have this concept of psychological safety, which is that they feel comfortable sharing ideas in front of one another and aren't waiting for somebody to kind of, like, they say something and they're like, is this person going to come back at me? Which can happen on teams if you have a manager who can micromanage you, or it can be overly critical. And people tend to keep these things to themselves and not say anything. Don't either come up with a new idea. The other example that they give a lot is the Challenger explosion space shuttle, that, if people don't feel comfortable pointing out engineering flaws because they're afraid that they'll actually give a false negative, people keep those things to themselves because the risk for a false negative is worse than just letting it go. And that's what happened with the Challenger. People eventually stopped reporting things, even though they saw problems, right? So that concept has become very, very important in engineering and companies as a whole, psychological safety, and how comfortable are you just, and it's analogous to a lot of research on actually relationships, that long-term relationships. People are the most successful when you put electrodes on them. And you ask one of them, what does your partner do around the house? And if one of their, heart starts racing, or they're, start sweating a little bit because they're afraid that their partner is going to jump on what they say, it's very much a long-term predictor of relationship instability, right? It's the comfort and psychological safety of being able to talk. I'm sorry, I'm going to babble on a little bit longer here, but the second point I was going to make in response to your question, how can you know if they're scrambling or correctly pivoting? I think sometimes you can't know because they don't know. Right?
Yeah.
And having been a founder myself, you just don't know sometimes, because every day it's a new thing. You think you're making it, then the next day you're not making it. Somebody wants to buy everything, then they stop returning your calls, right? And it's very hard to know sometimes if you're simply pivoting into success or keep on having to redirect and scramble, right?
Yeah, I think leadership is in many cases about being the buffer against uncertainty for your people. And at the CEO level, your buffer against uncertainty around, are we even on the right track? You don't show up every day and kind of, tell your employees, gosh, you know what? I'm really just wondering if we're just completely screwed here. You can't just kind of bring that dirty, that laundry to the office every day. Like, you have to be the buffer, all right? And as engineering leaders, you have a different level of buffer that you have to be. I think the engineering leaders have to be the buffer against the uncertainty of, how are we going to make this thing? How long is it going to take to make this thing? How much is it going to cost to make this thing? And we all know, just like you don't know really what's going to happen in the market, you can have all the best planning tools in the world, and you will get blindsided, as I'm sure you all know by now, on trying to predict the future about how long is it going to take to build thing X. And I think of the engineering leadership as the place where that particular uncertainty buffer happens. That's part of what I think of as that engineering leader's role, to be the place where you say, all right, buck stops with me. We all know that you can't predict the future, but I'm going to take a stand for the best guess I can make, and I'm going to take a stand for finding a way to make that happen.
So 2 things. Guys, please don't use your phones right now, out of respect for our speaker. Please put them away if you're on them right now. And somebody start a...
Unless you're tweeting about how amazing this is.
Somebody start a attendance sheet, please, if you can. Okay, we had one more question right there.
Yeah.
So during your first 2 jobs, it seems like you went into a very specialized area of engineering, that being like embedded programming. And I was curious if you could offer some insight sort of like the pros and cons versus going into a very specialized like area early on in your career, or starting out pretty broad and maybe getting more specialized from there, or becoming even more broad. What your opinion is on that?
It's a really good question. It sounds really specialized. That wasn't my experience of it, because as a small company, you're doing some things that are specialized, but then, as I said, we kept pivoting out of these products. So one moment I'm working on the software that runs on this whole device. The next thing I'm writing a Windows device driver to talk to that. Next thing I'm writing a Windows app that talks to the device driver that talks to the device. And then I'm writing something that actually has to do synchronization of data between that and a cloud-hosted service. And it just kept moving. So the size of the company helped to make sure that I didn't end up getting too pigeonholed. Now today, if I had stayed in that space and stayed in really an embedded space, then there'd be pros and cons to that. Like, for example, one of the really exciting companies that I love, we've talked about a little bit, a company called Joby Aviation. I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but building the reusable electric air taxi, fly you from Santa Cruz to SFO in 15 minutes for the price of an Uber. I mean, this is cool stuff. It sounds like total science fiction, and they are way further along in creating this vision than I think just about anybody realizes. I guarantee you'll be hearing a lot from them in the coming 12 months. When you walk into a place like that, like, hey, okay, can you write software that's going to do these safety critical stuff? Okay, it is C++, but it's modern C++. It's not, most people like C++, oh my God. No, it's, the language has kept up. And you're going to be going through stuff that has to be FAA certified. It's life and death critical stuff, safety critical stuff. It would be, I think the very specialized pathways evolve into really interesting things as well. So I think it's a little bit of a decision whether you would want something that you can easily move around with, like, hey, I can take this I can find a job doing this in any part of the world, versus something where you're excited about a particular industry and willing to make that deep dive commitment. But the small companies, in my experience, you end up wearing a lot of different hats. So even though we did some embedded stuff, it didn't end up feeling constraining in that way. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Tim.
Hey, Tim.
I happen to land in the embedded systems space. That's what I focus my studies here. I'm trying to start a startup, and what I've found is throughout doing embedded systems, the most valuable attribute of an engineer is their intuition to debugging. And as you're making things, you never know what's going to go wrong, and so experience to me is like the most valuable in this industry. First of all, how much do you agree with that? And then second of all, as a CEO, if you're trying to hire these engineers that have this experience, what do they look for in the company? What attracts them to a young startup that has a really cool idea but needs really experienced engineers?
Good question. Congratulations on being willing to try and start your own thing. It's a great journey, and it's not for everybody, and it is hard. I'll just comment briefly on that particular piece of it. One of the great things about if you start your own thing is you get to self-declare you're the CEO. Now on day one, it kind of doesn't matter, right? Because you're CEO of so far nothing, right? But in most other aspects of life, you need somebody else to give you the imprimatur that says, oh, you are the blah, blah, blah. I bestow upon you the title of whatever. And this is one of the few areas of life and one of the few areas of the world where you can just hang out a shingle that says, I'm the CEO of my company. And as long as you keep putting your shoulder into that every single day, the reality level of what that means grows. And you get to a point where later in life you go, yeah, I was a CEO of a startup. We ran it for 7 years, so many million in funding, sold it to this other guy. And all of a sudden you have this great credibility from something that just started with your willingness to self-declare and move past that feeling of being an imposter, right? The whole imposter syndrome concept, and just self-declare. You're going to feel like a complete fraud. And if you're willing to do that and move past that and stay with it, then you can create the reality behind it. And that is a scary, hard journey, but it's really, really rewarding. So you'd asked about how does a startup attract people. It doesn't hurt to do something really cool, right? I mean, right now we live in a world where if you get a job offer from Google, they're going to pay at a scale that most startups can't begin to touch. So how do you get people excited? Well, it's going to happen because they're excited about the vision of what you're building. That's the number one thing. Now, of course, it's also, there's got to be cultural fit and things like that as well. Hopefully they're paying attention to that. They should be. But I think more than anything else, it's, are you building something that you're really excited about and that you can paint a big enough vision and believe it yourself about what's possible? And this is where the imposter syndrome becomes really hard to get past. You do have to actually be able to convince yourself of the possibility of your big vision. But that's what does it, because some people are really drawn. I mean, a lot of us know if we got a job at Google tomorrow, that'd probably be really cool. But Google's already really huge. I mean, you're not going to build Google. Google's already built. And a lot of people will be excited about, I want to build something. You had another question in there I think I didn't answer. What was it? There was, how do you attract people? And what was the thing right before that? Oh, whether or not the experience and the intuition. Yeah. So what are you looking for when you're hiring? Is a really big question. I think if you're hiring engineering talent, one of the things that I love to see is people who actually love to do engineering. And one of the easy ways to see that is, do you do any engineering stuff for fun? Now, I don't mean to make it sound like you have to be the sort of person who wants to spend their weekends writing code, but it doesn't hurt. Like I know some people who, they're always doing some little side project, and that love of what they're doing, that's a really good sign. If you can ask somebody in an interview, tell me about some of the stuff you've done, that's not on your resume. I take that as a very positive sign. And there's, of course, lots of other things. You're going to need to hire people that you want to work with, and who are the interpersonal. You could go on a long conversation about this. If I had to pick a particular word, I would probably go with humility. I mean, I think working with people who can be audacious and humble at the same time, which sounds like it doesn't work, but it really can. If you can find those people, oh, that is beautiful. Because then, you've got somebody who can be excited about the vision. They're willing to really drive it, but they're also not going to be attached to I'm always right and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add to what you're saying, which is, about whether they're doing engineering projects on the side. The reason I think I've hit home a lot, repeatedly, about kind of make sure that you are driving towards what you actually want to do, and if you're not sure, keep looking for it before just getting a job, is that, our CEO at our company, his number one thing he always wants to see is if you're passionate about what you're working on, right? That's always what he's checking. And people in interviews can smell it out. They can tell if you're just getting a job and have prepared a day or two in advance to be a customer success manager, which is something I've interviewed for and I had no idea what it was, but I just wanted a job. Yeah. Right? Or if this is actually your area of interest. They can smell it out, right? Yeah. Roy, we talked before this a bit about the type of engineers that you actually, look for, I think, in a bigger company too. And you mentioned that, you said best practices, agile management. Were these just things that people had studied, but what overall qualities were you really looking for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wanted to throw out one trailing comment on this other thing. You guys heard the expression that basically Class A people will hire Class A people, but Class B people will hire Class C people? Is that a concept you've heard? It's really true. Good people want to work with good people. And people who are smart and ambitious, they will take really smart, ambitious, ambitious hopefully in a good way, but really smart, motivated people as coworkers over salary, right? Of course salary matters, absolutely. But I find really smart, motivated people are turned on by the idea of being in a group of smart, motivated people. So when you hire somebody, if you hire somebody who's kind of a B-grade person, you didn't just take the hit for the fact that now there's a B-grade person on your team, but they're going to affect your next hire because they're going to smell that. And not only that, B-grade people, and I'm obviously making gross generalizations here about what is a B-grade person. Don't take that too literally, right? But people in that, your best people will not be threatened by working with people who are better than they are at lots of things. They'll be stoked about that. And people who are a little bit, I can't think of a better term than your B-level people will be like, well, I'm going to hire this C-level person because they don't threaten me. And isn't that nice? Well, good luck with your company then. So you were asking about what are you looking for when you're hiring? I might be a little bit of a contrarian in this respect. I have a pretty deep-rooted distrust or mistrust for best practices as a whole. And what I mean by that is it's really easy to think, hey, I want to be a software engineer. How do I do that? Well, I'm going to get a book, and I'm going to learn about all the current things, and I'm going to learn about, and whatever. We could all come up with a list of buzzwords of what is considered to be best practices in programming today, both in terms of how you do it, what are the popular languages, the popular frameworks, the techniques, how do I organize my management. And those are really useful things to know, but they're just tools on your belt. And they can never be something that you can never let yourself get blinded and treat these as dogma. I like to say there is no machine that you can just turn a crank and success will fall out the other end of that machine. And it doesn't matter if it says agile on the side or it doesn't matter what it is. All of these best practices are what they are at this moment in time. And if you looked at them 10 years ago, they were different. And 10 years before that, they were different. And they will be different again. So I would say, absolutely, somebody who comes in, if you don't know about what some of the best practices are, then obviously you just kind of haven't been around or you haven't done your homework. So maybe that's not great. But I really like, it kind of comes back to humility. Like people who realize that there is no formula for success. You're going to have to show up awake every day and realize that your problem is your problem. Right, and that nobody else. There was a Google director. I wish I could remember his name, but he had a nice quote. He says, "Best practices are something written by somebody who knows less about your situation than you do, who's never been in your shoes." Now, that's maybe an overly negative view. Obviously, you want to learn from other people, but it's really useful, I think, to not take them too much to heart and realize that it's just the responsibility is going to be on you to find a way. We were talking earlier about what do you look for in somebody's resume or in their experience. I would ask somebody in an interview, tell me about a time that you had to deliver and you had no idea how you were going to deliver. And you were just up against it and you just didn't know how you were going to deliver. And this is telling me that it's time to move my car. Sorry about that. I don't actually have to move my car. That tenacity and the willingness to just stick with something is a lot more valuable than any knowledge of any specific practice, I would say.
Do you think these, questions? Do you think these qualities are trainable?
Yeah, definitely they're trainable. Trainable is a little bit tough because I feel like I got a lot of great exposure just by kind of osmosis. When you're around people who are like that and you work with people who are like that, then that's how you should be. So yeah, absolutely, you learn it, but I don't know if I could teach it in a class. I think it's something that you guys are doing actual projects that will require you to confront a ton of not knowing, a ton of uncertainty, and show a lot of tenacity. So you'll have the opportunity to definitely learn that. So yeah, I guess it can be learned in that kind of way.
Since we're talking about learning things, how did you update yourself while you were in the industry? It's easy to update yourself when you have all these resources in university, but once you're out, then your time and your resources are limited. So how did you go about it?
It's really easy to get lazy and not do it. And it's really easy to get pigeonholed based on what you have been doing, right? Because there's a natural tendency to want to go from whatever stepping stone you're on to wherever the next level is and feel like, oh, well, clearly the next thing I should do, I've been a manager of a team of 5, now I should be a manager of a team of 10. And you can get yourself on a specialization trajectory. That happened to me a little bit. I started a company that was using digital pen technology focused on just personal information management, like everything you write shows up in your planner, and isn't that nice, all digitized automatically, handwriting recognition, great. Ended up pivoting into healthcare for a whole variety of reasons. Didn't know anything about healthcare. And the ignorance is bliss. Turns out that healthcare IT, the complexity was much more than I realized. But fought through that and ultimately sold my company to NextGen, electronic health records company, and was there for 9 years, actually, up until just very recently. So now when recruiters call me, they say, oh, so you're a healthcare IT guy. You want to do electronic health record systems, right? Boy, I don't remember ever getting out of bed going, you know what I want to be? I want to be an electronic health records guy. But there is that push, that momentum of the very natural tendency to stay in that track. And I realize it's a little bit different than what you asked, but I feel like it's related, because if you're not paying attention, you just keep learning more and more of that thing. And if you're really happy with that, great. But it can end up putting real blinders on you. So, thank God we live in the era of Coursera. You can just be like, oh, you know what? I don't know enough about machine learning. Andrew Ng has a wonderful course, so great. And it's the availability of resources to get yourself exposed to new ideas is absurd, right? And there's so much more available than any of us can absorb. So then it just becomes a matter of, can you muster the self-discipline to decide to invest the time to make that happen? Yeah.
I did want to ask, as engineering leaders or future engineering leaders, as a VP of engineering, how would you identify somebody in your organization that would potentially be a leader going forward? Is it somebody that has extremely strong technical skills, that has been teaching inside the company and kind of driving forward on a project, or somebody that has leadership skills or management, right? Or is it both? Is that hard to find both? If you were to talk to the class about if they wanted to move forward into leadership roles, where should they put their focus on?
Well, that's a super good question, because there are, of course, different kinds of leaders, right? And there isn't any one kind of leader that is the right kind to be. So obviously the right kind of leader is the one that best matches your personality, I guess. I think what I've most often seen when I think about the people who've moved up the most successfully are it's like an emergent phenomena. You keep coming to work, you keep seeing the team, and at some point you realize that this person is just like there's just like a sphere of positive influence around them. People come to them with questions, but they're not pushing themselves on people. They're not promoting themselves. They're not climbing over the next guy to go look at me. But they're helping other people out. They're brainstorming, and they're doing it in a way that makes other people around them feel comfortable, so they're not making enemies. And it's like you just sort of start to notice that. And there's a good thing happening over here. And that's just a beautiful thing when you see it. Of course, it's about technical skills, but you guys have heard of the technique of the rubber duck. You can be the rubber duck, which is basically, so you put a rubber duck on your desk, and when you have a problem you can't solve, you explain it to the rubber duck, and by the time you get done explaining it, you will have solved your own problem. You don't have to be a technical genius to be very helpful to other people in helping them solve their problems, but you have to be willing And you have to be the kind of person who makes a connection with them that they will feel safe to do that with you, right? So a lot of it ends up being, I would say a lot of it ends up being on that personal level. Somebody that people feel comfortable with and are inspired by and who they want to work with. You know, I didn't have this, I've been thinking about, you know, the must-haves for any job that I would want to take. And one that's moved to really close to the top of the list is, you know, life's too short to work for an asshole. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that, but, you know.
You're allowed to say that.
Cool.
Our first speaker said that word, so yes.
Sweet. All right, we jumped right in there. You know, I'm going to throw out there, I'm curious to see what you guys think. One of my favorite interview questions these days, if I'm the interviewee, is I want to, you know, like, let's say for the sake of argument, the CEO is a guy. And I would say, so tell me, would you say the CEO is a good person? And the interviewer has about 3 seconds. And if the answer is kind of, tell me more about what you mean by good person, then it's time to leave, right? Because their influence, their personality, their ethics are going to flow down through the organization in an unstoppable way. And so it's really worth knowing ahead of time what you're getting into in terms of that personality, because it's amazing how pervasive that personality ends up being in my experience. Now, there are great leaders who are not really fun people to be around, but then they have to make up for it powerfully in some other way, whether they generate so much excitement about the great things that they're creating, you know, that can work, but it's tough to overcome.
It's one of the most insightful things I think I've heard in the speaker series, what you just said. It's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way beforehand, but that is absolutely true. In every job I've ever had, it reflects so much.
Run away. Your life is too valuable. You know, and I wanted to throw it out there. I mean, you guys are going to be going out into, you're going to be well equipped going out into the workforce. You're going to find there's a lot of people out there who are not as well equipped as you are. You'll be surprised. Probably, especially if you're going into bigger companies, you might think, oh, I'm going to go into this bigger company, and then they're going to be. I remember when Motorola, and I can badmouth Motorola now because they're large. The Motorola of then is no longer the Motorola of today. But I remember Motorola bought Starfish. I was like, oh my gosh, an incredible learning opportunity. We're going to go dig into the biggest mobile phone company's code and really learn all about how this works. It was just an absolute rat's nest. I couldn't believe this code was just a horror. And you guys will, I'm sure, have the same experience. You'll get out and like, I was somehow expecting a more elevated kind of everything. And I think you'll probably be pleasantly surprised at what you're able to bring to the table, you know, as you're getting out there. But I just wanted to say, you may find that you have to invest, some amount of time, climbing a ladder, finding your spot. Not every day is going to be the perfect job. But if it gets to be, a couple of years and it's not moving and you don't really dig it, leave. You have the incredible good fortune to be in a place where maybe this is I'm stating the obvious, but there's so much demand for you. You don't have to stay in something that isn't, that isn't good for you. I think on the hiring side, people do look out for people who just hop. So be aware of that. I was talking with somebody from Joby actually about the same thing. Like, well, it might be great for you to switch jobs every 2 years, but it's not great for me as the guy who's hiring, who needs to invest in you and see you grow in the company. So you don't want to do that frivolously, of course, but life's too short to be in something that isn't actually taking your career in a good direction.
Any questions?
So I mentioned that the first company I ever worked for was a startup, and then that just planted a seed of curiosity. And I just mentioned with the question in case people couldn't hear it, basically what made me want to go into a startup and to start my own. That planted a seed of real curiosity, like, wow, could I do that? What would that be like? And then, working with Philippe Kahn, who was just kind of a force of nature kind of guy who has started so many companies, and sort of having a chance to really participate in that, full on. It really left me feeling like it was just something I wanted to do. I wanted to see if I could. So, and I had the good fortune that at the time, it wasn't, my participation in when Starfish got bought, I got some money for that. That was great. It wasn't the kind of like, I'm going to go retire to an island kind of money. But it was the kind of money that I could step back and go, okay, well, if I'm ever going to start a company, this would be the time to do it. When's a great time to start a company? When you have nothing to lose, or when you have enough money that you can basically have some buffer. So it felt like the right time. So what do you do if you want to start a company? I started looking around for ideas. At the time, there were a lot of virtual currencies showing up in games. That was fairly new. I thought, there should be an exchange for virtual currencies to real currencies that goes between all the different games. And that was a fairly new concept at the time. That was one that I explored. There were a couple different ones. There was this digital pen technology I mentioned that really looked novel and interesting, like digitize anything that you wrote and it knew what you wrote on. That was important. So if you filled out this form or that form, it could tell the difference. But I wasn't seeing any really good applications of that. So that's the one I ended up going with. Because of the background in personal information management with Starfish, I knew a lot about how people tracked their contacts, their calendars, their notes, and how to synchronize all that stuff. And I'm really dating myself here, but back at the time, people used to carry around this thing called the Franklin Planner. It was like, you had to have one of these if you were serious, in the 80s in industry. It was the thing you carried around to prove that you were serious about your career. And it was a paper-based planner. So now, of course, as you're getting into the 90s, people wanted the stuff digital. I think, well, perfect opportunity to make the hybrid planner. You can work on paper, and it's all available electronically. So here's a classic example of what you should not do. Save yourself a lot of money. I dreamed up this wonderful idea for this hybrid planner. I paid industrial designers out of my own pocket to help me design this thing. I hired a team. Now, admittedly, we weren't paying much. It was like friends, like, hey, come help me start this thing. But, a lot of it was coming out of my own pocket. And we built this thing out to a beautiful prototype. And then I flew to Salt Lake City to meet with Franklin Covey. And I sat down with a vice president of product development. I'm like, this is my big moment. Pulled out my cool product and took him through it. And by the time I was done with the demo, he was just sitting back in his chair. And he's like, I couldn't quite read his look. He's like, this is an amazing product. I'm thinking, score. He's like, but, uh-oh. It turns out that just a couple of weeks ago, our board of directors decided to really change directions for the company, and we are divesting ourselves of all technology. We're going to be a paper and training company. We used to have software for like Outlook plugins and all this other stuff. We're getting rid of we're not doing any technology. I mean, I had spent so much time and money building a thing based on the idea that this one market channel was going to be the way to go because I just knew they would be so floored by this. Never occurred to me that the ground would just move under my feet before I even got there. And they fundamentally just wouldn't be the same business anymore. And I stepped back and realized, I have no market channel. I have no idea how to get this thing to people. I mean, I'm not going to build the whole direct-to-consumer sales channel, and like I don't have the money for that. So we started looking at how do you pivot a digital pen system, and of course, one of the things you can do with this is you can capture forms. So we did a ton of different projects to try and figure out. We did like police departments, they want to write you a ticket, and they want to give you the ticket, but they want an electronic copy of that, right? Didn't really want to actually encourage that behavior, so I kind of didn't want to do that one. Parking tickets didn't feel like great mojo. We talked to the military. It takes 18 pages of documentation to change the tire on an F-15. Well, it'd be really nice if all of that documentation, a lot of which is captured, out there on the tarmac with this pen and paper, that would make sense. Building inspectors, all these different places where if you could capture the data immediately. And then we got into healthcare and we realized, aha, Here's the unstoppable force of the government wants this data to be digital against the immovable object of the doctors don't want to have to sit behind a computer. And we said, we can solve that problem. We'll give the doctors, and of course, probably a lot of you are going, wait a second, doctors' handwriting? That's a bad idea, isn't it? There were some issues there, but that was what got us into healthcare. And what we ultimately found was the sweet spot was you walk into the doctor's office, they have you fill out this, your medical history, and then they go and they type it all in, which is, of course, nonsense, right? Why not just capture it as you write it? And a lot of things like visiting nurses that want to, home visits for the elderly, things like that, where the documentation can be done right there, and they can leave you a copy, but have an electronic copy. So that's what we ended up pivoting into. But it was a matter of trying a bunch of things till we found the thing that had traction. And I became an expert in electronic health records. I did not see that coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we'll end it in a bit. One side note.
This was fun.
One side note. My uncle in Beverly Hills is extremely rich because he started a company that he hired 3-4 people that were handwriting experts that could read the handwriting of doctors. For 20 years, he ran a company that every time a doctor wrote something that nobody could read for a deposition or some type of subpoena, they would sit there, read the handwriting, and type it up, and bill $300 an hour for it. And
wow.
Very, very wealthy. Really, extremely wealthy. So you were hurting his business with your point.
Oh.
But, okay, so like previous couple times, we'll end 10 minutes early so that you have a chance to speak to Roy and meet him. Any last questions before we end for today?
Yes.
What's happening for you now? Are you going to JV?
Yeah, so I'm trying to decide whether, fortunately, my situation is such that I can kind of step back and think a little bit about what I want my next chapter to look like. And I like startups a lot. So it would be fun to start another one, but frankly, I don't yet have an idea that I'm turned on about enough that I'd be ready to do that. So then the question would become, well, is there an existing smaller company? And for me, I'm thinking 200 and below is kind of the number of people. So yeah, it's an interesting time. There's a lot going on in machine learning. Obviously, that's an area that interests me a lot. I'm very interested also in genomics, well, genetics, but genomics is for the specifics and the intersection of machine learning and genomics. So I've been doing a lot of learning in that area. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and as it happens in Santa Cruz, there are a lot of companies in that space. So those are some of the things I'm exploring, but I'm not sure yet. This feels like one of those fertile times, like when you guys graduate and you have that wide open space of possibility, and all things are possible. It's a beautiful time, and it feels like that for the first time in 9 years for me. So it's a pretty cool time. I'll definitely happy to answer questions after. I would just leave you guys with a thought. I mentioned that your cohort is a really valuable resource, and I don't mean that in like the cheesy way, like, hey, chumming around to just try and use people for connection. I don't mean it like that at all. I do mean though that you're going to see these people again, and the people that you work with again, and take the time and the effort to keep those relationships going. It's easy to not do that, but the people that you connect with, the people that you genuinely like, the people you genuinely respect, you're not going to be able to fake it for people that you don't like. So don't even bother trying, right? But for the people that you connect with and you like and you respect them, make that investment and keep that going, because that connection is going to be there in 5 years and in 10 years and in 20 years. And it's amazing later, and you look back and go, holy cow, I'm still, I had lunch today with a guy that I worked with at Starfish, and it's great. It's a really valuable thing, so I encourage you to do that.
All right, good. Okay, Roy, fantastic.
Yeah, what a pleasure.
Great hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Roy drove from very far.
Yes, all the way from Santa Cruz.
To speak here, our furthest drive. So thank you. Yeah, you can ask some questions. One more hand. Thank you to Roy for coming.
Thank you very much.